All right, this video is going to be about Module 19, having to do with equilibrium. And so we're going to start with short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So in class, I had everybody write these 4 sentences down, and then you had to figure out if it was a change in aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply. Then you do need to graph it. So I do want you to actually draw in what happens to the short-run aggregate supply curve or the aggregate demand curve. Draw in the shift and determine what happens to the price level and the real GDP because the equilibrium has changed. So I want you to pause the video right now and I want you to try those 4 and then play the video back to be able to see if you're right. All right, hopefully you gave it a shot. So wages increase. Wages increase should be a change in aggregate demand, or a short-run aggregate supply. Short-run aggregate supply because this is having to do with nominal wages. If nominal wages are going to increase, that means it's going to cost the companies, businesses more to be able to hire workers and cost them more to be able to produce their product. So as a result, this is going to be a left shift in short-run aggregate supply. So we're going to move that to the left. And so now here's our new equilibrium. So what happened to our equilibrium price? Our price level went up, and what happened to our equilibrium quantity of real GDP? Well, it went down. So our price level increased and our output decreased. Number 2, people become more optimistic about the future. This is going to be a aggregate demand example. So this is a change in aggregate demand because of expectations, and if people are more optimistic about the future, things are looking up, they're getting better. They're going to do more spending, so that's going to be a right shift in aggregate demand. So a right shift in aggregate demand is going to look like this, and here's our new equilibrium. So as you can tell, our price level went up and our output went up as well. So we're producing more and the prices of everything went up as well. Number 3 says size of physical capital is large. So size of physical capital is large. This is again a aggregate demand example. This is going to have to do with the size of inventory. So this is going to be investment spending. And if the size of physical capital is large, that means that they don't need to make a whole lot more. So as a result, our aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. So we're going to draw it that way. And so here's our new equilibrium. And so our equilibrium price goes down, our price level goes down, our output goes down. And then last, number 4, productivity increases. So productivity increases, this is going to be a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. And if it increases, that means short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. So we're going to draw it over here, and here's our new equilibrium. And so now our price level has dropped and our output has increased. How'd you do? Hopefully well. The only thing that I want to also add is that in class I had everybody turn back to your chart that compared the factors that cause a change in aggregate demand. Label those as demand shocks. And go back to your factors, your chart that is the factors that cause a change in aggregate, short-run aggregate supply. Label those as supply shocks. Now, this left shift in aggregate supply, this one up here, this is a special kind of torture. Think about this. We're saying that basically the prices go up and we're producing less stuff. That sucks. This is a special kind of torture called stagflation. So would you please also label in your chart for short-run aggregate supply curve when you have the left shift, that's called stagflation. So will you label that stagflation for the left shift in short-run aggregate supply? Okay, that said, now let's look at long run. Okay, long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Long run, we're going to be looking at where all 3 curves intersect. Yes, I did say 3. Aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply. And the point where they all intersect is going to be where we have full output, our potential is at, our output is at our full potential, and we have our quote-unquote full employment. Why do I have full employment in quotations? Well, because this is our natural rate of unemployment. Remember that that is the best we're going to do when we have frictional and structural unemployment. So when we draw this correctly, okay, if we're at long run equilibrium, we're going to draw with our price level or real GDP. Remember, anytime you draw a graph, make sure you're actually going and labeling things. Here's our aggregate demand curve. Here's our short run aggregate supply curve. And now here's our long run aggregate supply curve. This point where they intersect is our potential output. That is going to be where we have, quote unquote, full employment. Okay? So we know, however, that that's not always the case. We're not always at long run equilibrium. So now what we have to talk about is what happens if we're not there in the short run. So what if, yeah, eventually we'll be there, but right now in the short term, we're not. Well, we have one of two possibilities. We can have, one thing is a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap is when the output is less than the full potential. So we're actually making less than what we could be making. So in this kind of scenario, what we have happening is that we're going to start with our regular old long run equilibrium. And then we have one of those demand shocks. And so now we're going to have an aggregate demand shift to the left. We're going to have a negative demand shock. So it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Okay? And by the way, this is the most common cause of a recessionary gap. However, we could also go and cause our short-run aggregate supply curve to change, and that would also lead to a recessionary gap. Anybody have a guess as to what direction short-run aggregate supply curve would have to change? Hopefully you said to the left, because if you drew a short-run aggregate supply curve to the left, our short-run equilibrium would also be less than potential output. So here is our new equilibrium. So this is our short-run equilibrium. Notice that our Y2 is going to be less than our Y1, which is our full potential. So as a result, the difference between these two is what we call our recessionary gap. So anytime our short-run equilibrium is less than our long run, then this is going to be a recessionary gap. Now, if I was drawing this just with it as a recessionary gap, I would not include this purple line here. I would not include the original aggregate demand curve. I'm telling a story, however, so that's why it's originally there. Okay, so we have our aggregate demand curve shift to the left. Maybe, for example, consumers are not very confident about the way the economy is going to be running and going in the future. So as a result, what happens is that we have that negative demand shock to the left. And so now it leads to a higher unemployment rate in the short run. Because remember, the full potential of long-run equilibrium is going to be where we are at our natural rate of unemployment. So anything less than that, what type of unemployment do we have? That's right, cyclical. Because remember, our natural rate of unemployment is going to include frictional and structural. If we have any unemployment rate higher than our natural rate, that means we have cyclical unemployment. Now, to finish this story off, eventually what will happen though is that, okay, now we have all of these people that are unemployed because we are producing less than our potential. So now what will happen is that we have all these people that are unemployed, and so now we definitely need to fix this, right? So, okay, we're having a recessionary gap. So we have people that are unemployed, so there's lots of people looking for jobs. There's not a whole lot of jobs to be had. So when you're looking for a job, it may come to the point where you're like, I'll do anything, just give me a job. All right, well, I'll hire you, but I can't pay you very much. I'm going to have to, pay you very little. All right, I don't care. Okay, that's fine. So people get hired that way. So what happens is that our nominal wages will eventually drop. And when our nominal wages drop, what happens to our short-run aggregate supply curve? Nominal wages drop. That means production levels are going to be cheaper, so our short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. So eventually nominal wages will decrease in the long run, and it will shift our short-run aggregate supply curve back to the right until it reaches our long-run aggregate supply curve. And here's our new equilibrium. And now look at that. Magically, we're at long-run equilibrium again. We're just at a lower price level. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. So again, I would not draw this entire graph that I have right now on the screen when I'm asking for a recessionary gap. Yes, I'm talking to you about your homework. So think about what parts of this would just show a recessionary gap. You don't need all of those lines. I'm explaining it from the standpoint of where we started and where we finish, not what the middle part looks like. So think about that. All right. The opposite of this is obviously, oh, I always forget this, output gap. The output gap is going to be how much basically there is a difference between the Y1 and the Y2 down here. So we would take our actual output, which would be our Y2, minus our potential output, which would be our Y1, divided by our potential output, again Y1, times 100. And that would tell us how much of a gap we actually have. All right. Now the opposite of a recessionary gap is an inflationary gap. So an inflationary gap is when output is more than the full potential. So we are actually making more than we potentially should. How's that possible? Well, let's start with this. So again, we're starting at our long run equilibrium. So everything's hunky-dory, we're at long run equilibrium. All of a sudden we have a shock. Maybe, for example, we have a shock that is going to be a positive demand shock. So maybe, for example, interest rates drop. Okay, if the interest rates drop, what happens to our aggregate demand curve? It's going to shift to the right. Okay, so now we have a right shift in aggregate demand, and now we have a new short-run equilibrium. So our short-run equilibrium is here, so notice that our Y2 is going to be higher than our Y1. We're actually producing more than what is our fullest potential. Okay, so again, I would not draw this purple line in here if I was drawing an inflationary gap. I'm just telling the story of where it goes. So now here's what happens is that the difference between the Y1 and the Y2, this is our inflationary gap. But what does that exactly mean? How is it possible that we are producing more than what's actually potential? Remember our unemployment rate? With our Y1, we are at our natural rate of unemployment. So if Y2 is going to be higher than that, what does that mean? That means our unemployment rate is actually lower than the natural rate. How's that possible? Remember, our natural rate is going to be made up of our frictional and structural unemployment. So if we're at Y2, that means that we have less frictional and structural unemployment. So in the short run, we have lower unemployment in the short run. Now, this is not sustainable. We can't, this, you're like, hey, this sounds awesome. We have a whole bunch of unemployment. We have a whole bunch of people out there that have jobs. But also, look, what's the problem here? Oh, we have higher prices. We have inflation. That's why this is called the inflationary gap. So what's going to happen is that over time, okay, we have a whole bunch of people out there that have jobs. Not a whole lot of people looking. Eventually what will happen is that we will have employers that are actually hiring, and they can't get anybody to actually fill the position. And so they start to get desperate. So what are they going to do? They say, come on, come work for me. Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I want to work there. I'll sweeten the deal. What would I have to do? They'd probably have to raise their wages. And so if we're raising nominal wages, if the nominal wages go up, what happens to our short-run aggregate supply curve? It's going to shift to the left. So eventually nominal wages will increase in the long run, and it'll shift our short-run aggregate supply curve back to our long-run aggregate supply curve, and now we have a new equilibrium, and it's going to be higher, a higher price level than our original equilibrium at E1. Okay? Again, this is the complete picture of a self-correcting graph. Eventually, everything will lead back to the long-run equilibrium, where we are at our full potential. Okay? Eventually. Remember that this is what it looks like when it's self-correcting. Just a question of how long does that take? That's the question for the next unit. All right, I will talk to you later. Let me know if you have any questions.